So many Codex chapters are basically just Ultramarines for a bit, and Harlequins are no longer a full faction in Warhammer 40K. Let's talk about them and others with a few changes to the full faction lineup in 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today I thought we'd do a quick roundup of a few of maybe the slightly more peripheral factions in Warhammer 40k, sub-factions like Space Marines and Chaos Legions, Eldar Harlequins and Ynnari, and see how they're getting on in 10th edition and what the new indexing has meant for them. Over the years, 40k certainly has a whole bunch of really big stable factions, things like Orcs, Chaos Space Marines, Tau, the Imperial Guard and others, but as well as all of the ones that are really quite big, recognisable and have been around for a very long time. But certainly over the years there's been plenty of armies that are either slightly peripheral or borderline sub-factions of other armies that Games Workshop has sort of waxed and waned with support for over the years. These are perhaps just a few more notable examples out of them, among others. Obviously, we've famously had the removed support for the Squats, the space dwarves that went away and returned as the Leaguers of Votan eventually. The Militarum Tempestus Silence had their own codex back in 7th edition, and then got mini-codex support throughout 8th and Psychic Awakening. Khorne Demonkin were their own thing at one point, a fairly fun faction throughout 7th edition that a lot of people kind of miss. Court Mechanicus and Skitarii were initially separated in different codexes, though I feel like that did feel a bit pointless on the AdMech perspective. The Force of the Inquisition have been more or less usable in various forms. The Divergent Space Marine chapters like Dark Angels and Blood Angels have sometimes been their own factions, or sometimes sub-factions of Codex Space Marines, and the same is true of the Chaos Legions as well, often having supplements of their own. There's then the more Codex ones, which again have varied in a little bit of a different way, and perhaps particularly relevant for this video are the Ynnari and the Harlequins. The Ynnari introduced in 8th edition as part of the plot point to get Guilliman back, though support for them kind of gradually eroded, and the Harlequins have been a full faction in Warhammer 40k, though basically with 10th edition they're now just a subset of Eldari, and they aren't really their own thing. There really are quite a lot of these semi-factions in 40k, each with their own interests and quirks. 10th edition has certainly changed up things quite a bit though. At launch we've had the indexes, and as basically a full hard reset of the game, Games Workshop has had to take a look at every single one of these and think about how they're going to be reinterpreted this time round. Some of them have changed a bit, some of them not so much. Maybe the biggest changes to the Harlequins and the Codex chapters and the Chaos Undivided Legions, but a lot of the others have shifted around a bit as well. First up, I thought we'd start with the Harlequins, as I'd say that they're the biggest change. Basically, throughout 8th and 9th edition, they've been treated as a full faction in Warhammer 40k. They've been out of the Eldar Codex for really quite a while, with their own one separately. Certainly not a big codex with just a few characters, their troops, their transport, and their jet bikes, but still an army that despite that has managed to be surprisingly successful perhaps. Games Workshop seem to have kept the Space Clowns actually surprisingly competitive, particularly for most of 9th edition. Mid-9th they were kind of rolled into Codex Eldari, certainly all the units appeared there and they did have a fair few overlap rules, but despite that they still pretty much remains their own individual full faction. You could still choose their Sadas of Light, Dark and Twilight, and there were incentives to field them as their own thing, getting those Luck of the Laughing God rerolls among a few others. The change in 10th edition seems to be that they're basically just an Eldari keyword within their index now. Maybe perhaps not enormously surprising, but still an absolutely massive shake-up for people who happen to have a Harlequins army. It's really quite a big deal for you to have your own standalone codex, and then suddenly just be a slight bit of an afterthought within another faction's index. The way they work is that you still have the same units that you had before. The Harlequin troops aren't battle line, and you can field far less Void Weavers than you had before, though you can get battle line on the troops if you choose to take a Troop Master as your warlord, and that will just about allow you to still field a full Harlequins army, though I'd say that with the fewer jet bikes that you can field between Void Weavers and Sky Weavers, you're probably going to have more trouble with that than before. Even just the limit on troops to battle line is still a bit of a limitation. Previously, full troop and Skyweaver armies might be going anywhere up to 9 mini troops in Skyweavers, and you can't do that in 10th edition due to the 6 maximum of battle line rules. Perhaps the biggest shame, though, is that really quite a lot of their movement mechanics have gone away. The things that made them feel just a little bit more unique within the Eldari lineup, things like their flip belts allowing them to just dance over enemy models and terrain, and their rising crescendo type ability allowing them to advance and charge and fall back and charge. If you want those sort of movement shenanigans, you either need the Battle Host stratagems, paying command points per unit, or to have buffing characters like a Shadowseer along, who can speed you up a little bit with Twilight Pathways. Still a bit of a come down though, compared with having those rules on every single unit. I feel like even if you technically can field a full army of Harlequins as well, there's just not really much incentive to do so. Fielding nothing but Harlequins seems like it's just going to be strictly suboptimal to mixing in both Eldari and Harlequins in the same army. Unlike the pure faction rule that they had before, you don't get anything else special for fielding Harlequins in their own detachment. You're basically just not really gaining anything by passing up good Eldari units. I feel like the change will be felt really quite hard by Harlequin collectors. Plenty of people out there will have very decent sized forces of the army. I think it will hurt a bit going from basically having a full faction support to having most of the rules kind of tailored around the Eldari as a greater super faction. There's just not going to be quite as many things like stratagems or tricks specific to the troops or jet bikes. I guess maybe you could have had a bit of a debate as to whether or not Harlequins were really a good idea to make into a full faction all by themselves. I feel like in lore they maybe tend to be a little bit on the peripheral side within Eldar. They definitely do make war in certain conflicts themselves, though quite a lot of the time it might be more sort of individual troops and war bands fighting for certain causes, as opposed to being fielded as a flat out army unless they're defending the Black Library or something. While they do have a good following, because basically all armies in Warhammer 40K do, I would say that they're probably one of the very most niche factions in the game. Again, maybe that's partly due to just seeing them as a bit niche within Eldari, plus a fairly tiny model range that Games Workshop doesn't really support very well, and perhaps just being a tiny bit limited in scope with where Games Workshop could realistically take them beyond this. I feel like some troops, transports, and jet bikes already seems kind of well realised for the Harlequins as they appear in the lore, though I guess there's always room for additional creativity if they wanted to go that way. In any case, though, looks like they're just basically a flavour of Eldar for a while. I'd guess they'll almost certainly get a themed detachment in Codex Eldari, but that's not going to happen for really quite a long time in 10th edition now. They've teased all the codexes up to spring 2024, so I guess summer 2024 would be the absolute earliest that you could expect to see that, and it could certainly be later. I'll certainly be interested to hear what you guys think of the change, though. Otherwise, perhaps the other biggest faction shifts are the Codex chapters being rolled into Codex Space Marines, and kind of the same thing going on with the more Chaos Undivided type legions out of the Chaos Space Marine Codex. They were definitely already in the Codex, but both of these armies have basically lost their own individual chapter tactics and whole reams of stratagems, warlord traits, and relics and things. For the Space Marines, there to be armies like Ultramarines, Imperial Fists, Salamanders, White Scars, Iron Hands, and Raven Guard. For Chaos Space Marines, armies like Night Lords, Word Bearers, or Black Legion. You can certainly reflect these armies' fighting styles by the units that you pick and the lore and paint scheme that you have of the army, but in terms of in-game rules, the only thing that's actually going to differentiate them at all will be the actual unique characters that you might be able to pick, and certainly most of these on the Chaos Space Marine side don't have any at all. Not great in terms of any sort of Iron Warriors rules representation, bar just taking miniatures that fit their general look and theme. The Space Marines are served a little bit better, where each one of the major chapters at least has one unique character that they can take for them. A fair few of them do some fairly appropriate things for the army as well. Say Vulcan Hestan giving some wound rerolls with things like Torrent or Melter type weapons. That's quite good for keeping a bit of the spirit of the old Salamanders rule. But still, most of these have lost quite a lot. Their own chapter tactics or legion traits, relics, warlord traits, and stratagems for the unique legions and chapters. The Space Marines also had a table of psychic powers each as well, and their own unique combat doctrine. I guess for a lot of these, they generally do have the flavour of being sub-factions of either Space Marines or Chaos Space Marines, but these ones are just all particularly prominent and storied due to basically having loads of lore behind them for the Horus Heresy, things that maybe just don't exist quite as much for, say, individual Chaos Knight households or individual Tau Septs. There is certainly lore and feel to those, but just nowhere near as much as there are for the Space Marine chapters and legions. I guess eventually, again, these will be realised in themed detachments in their codexes. Codex Space Marines should be here at least fairly soon, so they don't have quite as long to wait. I believe that Chaos Space Marines was one of the ones that was billed for spring 2024, so at least they're not going to be waiting basically most of the edition this time round. I guess we'll probably get detachments that fit the fighting style of each one of these forces, probably some sort of infiltration type one for Raven Guard, maybe one themed around Demonkin and Possession for Word Bearers perhaps. Still though, until then you're going to be playing some slightly more vanilla flavoured Space Marines or Chaos Space Marines. I guess at least the Space Marines do have the option of using the detachment rules for other flavours of them. Maybe picking up some Blood Angels or Black Templar style rules if it fits the playstyle better, though you will be forbidden from using your special characters then. Otherwise, taking a quick look through a bunch of the rest of that list and how they're getting on in 10th, the reincarnation of Ynnari now must have Ivrain as the warlords to basically activate them as a sub-faction. Perhaps a tiny bit restrictive and arbitrary, though I guess that's one way of getting the job done. Ynnari basically feel like they've been gradually losing faction status since they came out in 8th edition. Originally they were kind of their own full faction with their massive strength from death mechanic, then that got rewritten mid-8th with their own mini codex in a white dwarf with a whole bunch of stratagems and things. Then in 9th they became basically a different flavour of Craftworld that could soup in some Drukhari units. Now besides their characters, they've basically lost just about any unique special rules. The only thing that they have really is the ability to soup in Drukhari. You give up a few things like the Avatar of Cain and Phoenix Lords and Homunculus Covens, but for that price you get to mix basically any Drukhari units into an Eldar force, and Harlequins are super de-restricted now as they're basically just Eldari units, so you can have as many or few as you like. Definitely nice that they haven't been just completely neglected. The Drukhari allies rules do seem to be kind of less restrictive than they were before really, with having to match battlefield roles and things. I feel like they're definitely lacking about as much flavour as ever though, bar what their characters give them. Khorne Demonkin hasn't really been a thing for a while since 7th edition, but I do quite like the allied chaos rules this time round. Both Chaos Space Marines and World Eaters could take 500 points of Khorne Demons if you want to at 2000 points, and Chaos Space Marines can take a bunch of Khorne Berserkers from the World Eaters Codex, which I think is kind of fun. Overall, allied chaos seems kind of alive and well, and probably quite powerful really, able to cherry pick the data sheets they want to throw into their Chaos army if they want to, though not too many of them. Otherwise, Inquisition have always been sort of a peripheral army, not many units, but sort of able to borderline scrape together a force if they really wanted to for themed games. They're in a bit of an interesting place in 10th edition, basically entirely excluded from running their own detachments or anything like that. They don't even have a launch detachment sadly, but adding them into other Imperial armies is perhaps easier than ever. You basically get up to one character and up to one retinue per every 1000 points that you have, and there's no other real restrictions beyond that. You don't have to fit them into arbitrary patrol detachments or anything. Definitely very free to include, but also very peripheral. I feel like including just a launch detachment for them might not have been the worst thing in the world, even if it's made clear that it's not really seriously aimed to be on the same sort of level as other factions, just to make them playable. Again, the divergent chapters from Codex Space Marines have sort of landed in the sort of halfway to being full factions box. They will have their own indexes and codexes, but again will be dependent on core Codex Space Marines it would seem. Both the moment and most of the generic Space Marine units are all listed in Index Space Marines, with the Dark Angels or Black Templars indexes only having their unique units and their detachment rule. So again sort of feel like they're halfway to being full factions, though as they can all use the Gladius detachments sort of feel like slightly Space Marines plus really. They've got a whole ton of unique units, and if those unique datasheets actually wind up being kind of strong, there's not really anything to oppose them being the main way to play Space Marines, at least at the moment. Not unless, say, the generic Space Marine characters like Guilliman Kasaro Khan or Ironfather Phyros, for example, are just massively powerful. Otherwise, the Militarum Tempestus Scions are very much remaining part of Codex Astra Militarum, which is probably best to be honest, given that they don't exactly have a huge model line to themselves. Seems that the biggest nod that they're getting to them being a mini faction of their own is that Scions become battle line if you've got a Tempestor leading the army. It's still limited to just the 3 Valkyries, unfortunately, so it doesn't look like air cavalry is going to be making a comeback anytime particularly soon. Finally, Emperor's Children being perhaps a bit of an oddball case in basically a divergent Chaos Legion. Their army special rule is that you need to have Lucius as your warlord to kind of unlock them, and then they get some battle line Noise Marines and some restrictions on what demons you can ally. No other major special rules, but with Noise Marines being really quite cheap to field at the moment, seems like they could be really quite popular. Overall, really quite a lot of small changes about. I'll be interested to hear your takes on where the factions have wound up in 10th edition. Are you pleased with how Games Workshop's realised your own army and their status within the greater factions of Warhammer 40k as a whole? And I'm particularly interested to hear thoughts of Harlequins players and how big a deal it is to be within Codex Eldari proper now, as opposed to having own detachment rules. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and if you're interested in supporting, then you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.